The plight of local news organizations today is fundamentally tied with the core concepts of PBE. Not only is it economic in nature, with the business model collapses due to the advertising revenues primarily gained by Facebook and Google, which gobble up 60% of all advertising revenue, but it is one rooted within the philosophy of why local news and national news is important to democratic discourse. Since 2000, we have lost 1 in 5 newspapers and created numerous news deserts throughout the United States. The question that remains is, should it be up to the government or to the markets to help solve the journalism crisis that now faces the United States? In order to understand the problems that are currently facing the journalism industry, we must first take a look at the history of how news organizations were funded. News sheets were first started in Beijing in the 8th century, but the first true massively enabled distribution of newspapers began in Europe with the Gutenberg press. These early newspapers made money primarily through subscriptions, since they had limited distribution and a time-consuming and effort-consuming creation process. Eventually, with the creation of the paper-making machine and steam-powered cylinder presses, newspapers gained a massively enhanced reach, leading to an enhanced distribution of labor, with journalists primarily focused on creation of the news and craftsmen for the creation of the newspapers themselves. These new machines required a lot of capital, which meant that newspapers had to turn to advertisement-based businesses rather than sustaining themselves on subscriptions alone. This advertising-based method continued until the rise of TV and radio, which had much better distribution models than newspapers. This led to 2 separate models. First, the European nonprofit and government-supported model, where there was a fee for households on radio waves and therefore that could be used to support news. And the US, which had over-air signal for free, and thus relied more on for-profit model broadcast, which was also advertisement-based. This led to an advertisement's arms race and the development of larger newspaper chains that could finally compete with TV and radio. In order to maintain the cohesion of local newspapers, the US Department of Justice approved joint operating agreements allowing for 2 competing papers to merge business operations while maintaining separate newsrooms, and this led to increased consolidation, with local news having a monopoly over local advertising, which led to massively increased profits. These profits drew the interest of larger newspaper chains, which competed to acquire these very profitable newspapers. Eventually, as these newspaper chains became public companies, there was an increased need to be attentive to shareholders, which led to the growth of objective, long-form journalism. This increasing consolidation continued until the internet came along, when Facebook and Google became large platforms and advertising monopolies that gobbled up the advertising revenue from these newspaper chains, which had been operating on this advertisement-based business model for hundreds of years. And thus, when the financial crash happened in 2008, private equity firms and hedge funds gobbled up those newspapers in order to save them, viewing them as investments rather than core pillars of democracy. A large amount of this blame has fallen to publishers, with outlets like the New York Times saying, wasn't it up to publishers when things were fat and happy to invest for this foreseeable crisis? And wasn't it the publishers themselves who leapt into the arms of online aggregators and now want government intervention for what seems to be a business negotiation gone bad? Typically, in PBE, when there's a market failure, it seems quite evident that the government should be the one to step in to provide the service. But historically and societally, if not constitutionally, it seems that there is a general willingness for the separation of news and state. In order to investigate the potential role of government intervention in the local news crisis, we need to ask 2 fundamental questions about the philosophy of journalism. Firstly, why are news organizations so important? And secondly, what is the degree to which we are willing to allow the government to fund our news? It seems fairly evident to most people that news is fundamentally integral towards a well-functioning democracy. But beyond the First Amendment and the prohibition of the abridging of the freedom of the press, is there a strong constitutional line for how much the state can interfere and aid in the dissemination of news? In fact, the separation of news and state has never been particularly strong. Tax breaks, postal subsidies, and public notice requirements have been strong drivers of revenue within the entire journalism industry. Public notices, for instance, have driven $1 billion of revenue. The FCC fairness doctrine has existed before, which required holders of broadcast licenses to present controversial issues of public importance, such as control of a narrative. And there still exists defamation law and a general lack of whistleblower protection. In addition, the public generally trusts public broadcasting, which is in aggregate funded roughly 40% by government. And yet, if we give the government the okay to help contribute towards maintaining local news, maintaining neutral help is still very important. In terms of consequences, we could look at Argentina, whose 4 largest newspapers have been shown in a study to have very strongly correlated willingness to cover government scandals and the amount of money they receive from the government. But why overregulate if the market can solve these forces, potentially? The journalism industry has been abuzz with new types of market strategies in order to help sustain these businesses. One of these most promising models is subscription-based, with large titans like New York Times branding himself as subscription-first business and making over $1 billion of revenue in subscriptions. This has several interesting implications. On one hand, in contrast with previous advertisement-based models, where the newspapers weren't beholden to their subscribers, subscriptions promote catering towards the largest audiences, which means that stories will become less partisan. On the other hand, this could be potentially bad since a handful of news outlets, the largest ones with the most sustainable subscriber models, determine the broader national discourse. In addition to this, the very tech titans that brought the downfall of the advertising-based model for news could be helping fund the new news sources as well. Facebook, for instance, as well as Google with their Google News initiative, have pledged hundreds of millions of dollars to support journalism. And this isn't necessarily philanthropic. Having better news sources and more local news sources helps keep users on their sites, which means that these costs are fundamentally factored into the equations to help ensure the efficient market hypothesis. Furthermore, there are other models like local for-profits, like the Seattle Times, the LA Times, and the Boston Globe, as well as membership and subscription-based models for smaller outlets like Berkeley Side. Ultimately, if we can allow the markets to determine what information is valuable and what perspectives are valuable as well as models, then we may not want to create regulations that help support local news that isn't serving the community since they're not being upheld by the market. But at the same time, the value of news has greater externalities than just the inherent values brought to any individual consumer. The debate of whether or not the United States government should be helping fund these news sources is fundamentally tied with our comparisons to other first world countries, like Norway, which spends about $135 per capita each year on its public broadcasters, Germany $107, France $55, and Canada $22. The US, in contrast, spends nearly $2.50 per capita. And while this may seem to lead to a conflict of interest between their economic considerations and their civic duty, all these countries that have high per capita spends rank high on press freedom indexes and low corruption. Market forces might also not be able to take into account certain considerations. For instance, the assumption that needs are always reflected by willingness to pay is not necessarily true in economically struggling communities, which may not have surviving newspapers even though they might need them the most. But even if the government does decide to distribute actual money, how will they do so? One proposal has been public service ads, like public health, which has been proposed in the coronavirus season as a way to both disseminate vital information as well as boost ad revenue. Questions of sustainability also arise. For instance, the CARES Act has the SBA, the Small Business Administration, approving loans and grants to keep payroll in place for newspapers. And similar acts are being thrown out by Canada and a few other nations. But this creates the question of creating subsidy-dependent news outlets, which ultimately harms the long-term potential of news. What could be more sustainable are plans like California's initiative that could brute force instant transitions to digital for local news. In addition, it's possible to force tech giants like Google and Facebook to pay for news on their platforms, which helps solve for externalities that are generated by their dominance over the advertising industry. Canada has also released a $595 million package in support of journalism, which also includes a non-refundable tax credit which allows subscribers to claim 15% of the cost of subscriptions of digital news media. By giving subsidies to consumers and allowing them to make choices, it's possible to preserve the United States' willingness to separate the news and the state. Other potential solutions include a Newspaper Revitalization Act, which turns newspapers into educational nonprofit entities with a special tax status, and a direct injection of money into local newspapers like the Civic Info Bill from New Jersey, where funds are distributed by a group of New Jersey media, tech, academic, and civic stakeholders instead of the government. In the face of a potentially industry-threatening market, it's easy to think the solution is governmental intervention, and yet it is also important to still be cautious and prevent governmental funds from merely being a temporary band-aid on top of systematic market failures by the news, or from becoming a permanent source of money, with the added risks of incentive misalignment. Ultimately, it is the philosophical matter of how much influence the government should have on the news industry and the decisions of policymakers and the press on the ability of the news industry to perform in the market, which will form the basis of the solutions for future journalism.